thrilled to be chairing this. Edward Stringer, a retired air marshal, but a military man who realised after many tours in Whitehall that wars are all about economics, and they're about societies that can mobilise and they can work with allies and they can get their supply chains working and they can provide their military with a continuous stream of materiel better than the opposition. And we obsess about the front line. That's not actually where wars are won and lost. I'm going to stop there because someone here today knows a lot more about this than I do and is going to talk us through what the government's doing to help us win those fights. So it's a delight to welcome today Nusrat Ghani MP, the Minister of State for Industry and Economic Security. She's also been the MP for Wealdon in Sussex since 2015, and already in the time this is her second ministerial appointment. And she has great moral authority to talk on this because I'm actually jealous of the fact that she has been sanctioned herself by the Chinese government for the principal stand she's taken even before she was a minister, and she reminded me actually she's been sanctioned by the Russians too. So no one has a better moral platform to talk to us about sanctioning those people who would do us harm and how we are trying to help our allies in the fight back against them. Nusrat Ghani, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here at the Policy Exchange to launch the new Office of Trade Sanctions Implementations. I will speak for a few moments and then we'll hopefully open this up to a debate and I'll take some questions as well. The UK has led the world in its support for Ukraine and its condemnation of Putin and its illegal war. We were the first country to send our Prime Minister to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky at the start of the war. We were at the forefront of providing military and humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian people. When it mattered, the UK stepped up to the plate. And in turn, this support has been recognised by the Ukrainian people, dubbing the UK Ukraine's best friend. However, since the very start, we have also recognised that we cannot rely on military force alone. Time and again, history has shown us that when economies fail, so do tyrants. That is why, together with our allies, we have imposed the most severe sanctions Russia has ever faced in its history, targeting more than 1,900 individuals and entities and 19 Russian banks with global assets of £940 billion, effectively weaponising the ruble and providing the financial punch to send Putin and his ambitions reeling. Sanctions are an important tool in our diplomatic arsenal that allow us to respond to global threats, not just with words, but backed up with actions. We estimate that without combined sanctions, Russia would have over $400 billion more to fund its war machine. We've used them not only to weaken Putin's war efforts, but also to showcase our unyielding support for Ukraine to deter corrupt activity and cyber attacks, and to demonstrate our condemnation of international human rights violations and abuses. We also want to make sure that we respond to wider HMG international priorities, such as the threat of climate change. We can't do that without engaging with countries at events like COP, so our trade sanctions work must be consistent, clear, and boundaried to make diplomatic relations in other fora as constructive as possible. Now, my department, DBT, has played a significant part in this work, developing trade sanctions that have had a £20 billion impact on the Russian economy, including barring Russian businesses from benefiting from our world-renowned services sector. And thanks to these measures, imports to the UK from Russia have fallen by 94% since the start of the conflict, while UK goods exports have plunged by 74% and services exports have fallen by 50%. Make no mistake, these measures are working. Step by step, the sanctions imposed by the UK and its allies are destroying Russia's ability to maintain, upgrade and modernise its economy, placing a chokehold on investment and productivity, the building blocks of the war machine, which means while Ukraine's military equipment is improving, Russia's is degrading. But of course, the UK has used sanctions before, but never on this scale or scope or with such level of urgency. As a result, we've become ever swifter and more capable at imposing such measures. But we know we can't be complacent. We need to stay ahead of those who dream up tricks to swerve sanctions or create workarounds. Having one of the most robust sanctions regimes in the world is not good enough if we cannot have absolute, unwavering confidence that our rules are being enforced and that no one is exploiting the loopholes in the system. That is why We recently carried out a cross-government review of how we implement and enforce sanctions, which highlighted areas where we can do more. For instance, we need an expanded toolkit of enforcement powers for trade sanctions breaches, just as we have for financial sanctions. These additional civil enforcement powers will complement HMRC's existing and continuing powers to take forward criminal prosecutions. That expanded enforcement toolkit will also be crucial to our efforts, working in lockstep with our international allies to clamp down on trade via third countries to Russia. These powers will allow us to act where there is a UK national or a UK registered company involved. And internationally, we are working closely with the US and EU sanctions coordinators to liaise with several third-party countries to highlight the risks of circumventing trade sanctions and together to support them to enforce sanctions effectively. This has included joint diplomatic outreach to countries where we are seeing spikes in trade of sanctioned goods with Russia. For example, in recent months, we have sent joint delegations to countries like Kazakhstan, UAE and Uzbekistan to highlight these risks. I have personally recently been to Kazakhstan and Mongolia and seen for myself the challenges we face. But our coordinated efforts are paying off, and a number of countries, including Turkey, Kazakhstan and Armenia, have announced concrete measures to reduce the risk of sanctioned goods reaching Russia. So you can see how it is critical that we act. Today, I'm proud to say that this is exactly what we are doing with the creation of the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, or short called OTSI. The office will build up our trade sanctions capability and make sure our sanctions regimes are as impactful as possible. It will also crack down on companies that breach trade sanctions and so help to facilitate warmongers and tyrants to cling to power. Its remit will include civil enforcement of trade sanctions as well as providing guidance to businesses and supporting compliance. We expect the office to be ready to enforce trade sanctions next year once its new legal powers are in force. Today's announcements come from listening to businesses telling us that they want to know what more they can do to get it right. Most have been exemplary in their responses to Russia's invasion, experiencing the sometimes painful financial consequences of complying with these sanctions to stand up to Putin's tyranny. But we do recognise the scale and pace of sanctions work has been challenging at times. The new office will do more to clarify our expectations and lend support to businesses, ensuring those who play by the rules won't lose out to those companies that just don't. That is where OTSI will come into its own. But we'll also need business expertise, guidance and input to make sure the new unit is as effective and as impactful as possible. In terms of its function and responsibilities, OTSI will lead on the civil enforcement of trade sanctions. It will have a range of enforcement tools available, including levying monetary penalties on those that break the rules and sanction dodgers. And while OTSI will sit within the Department of Business and Trade, its work will complement the work of other government departments and offices responsible for the implementation and enforcement of other sanctions regimes. This includes the Treasury's Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, which remains responsible for financial sanctions, the Department for Transport, which remains responsible for transport sanctions, and the Home Office, which is responsible for immigration sanctions and for modern slavery. In addition, overall leadership of sanctions policy will continue to sit with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. OTSI is the key in the government's delivery of its economic deterrence initiative announced by the Prime Minister earlier this year in the Integrated Review Refresh. This initiative is focused on strengthening our tools to deter potential aggressors and just stop them in their tracks. One of the key objectives of this initiative is building expertise across government in the design, implementation and enforcement of sanctions as they achieve maximum impact. The new office will better support the implementation and enforcement of all trade sanctions, not just in terms of Russia, but for rogue regimes right across the world. In fact, Parliament will soon be considering the government's latest trade sanctions package, which includes further export and import bans and financial restrictions for Russia. Crucially, this new package will also ban the export of a range of goods, including the latest items Ukraine has encountered on the battlefield, such as machine parts and chemicals, as well as products that raise revenue to fund Putin's war machine. In essence, once the legislation is passed, only low-risk humanitarian, food and health exports to Russia will remain unsanctioned. And there's more to come. The UK remains committed to upholding the rule of law, which protects global security and human dignity in all parts of the world, especially the most vulnerable. We are more united than ever in the pursuit of international peace, prosperity and sustainable development, and I have strengthened our engagement with international partners beyond the G7. We've seen how well sanctions can work, and we're getting even better at using them. That's why I've no doubt that the Office of Trade and Sanctions implementation will be a game changer for the UK on the international stage, allowing us to move in lockstep with our allies on economic sanctions as they are needed. Sanctions are crafted to be targeted and focused to have a maximum impact. We've used them to disrupt all avenues for Putin to pay for his illegal war. OTS is also going to be a game changer for British businesses at home, where my department will help in building stronger international supply chains and which are not dependent on malevolent foreign actors. On Wednesday, I'm hoping to launch my critical import supply chain paper to help businesses too. In turn, this will translate into the prosperity and security that will benefit our citizens long into the future. I'm really grateful for Policy Exchange in allowing me the moment today to launch OTSI, and I look forward to working with all of you, especially if you're business, and how we develop this work going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. A superb introduction to an incredibly complicated subject. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that follow from it. If you do have questions, you put your hand up, and then just there will be microphones that go around. And if you could just state your name and which organisation you're representing here before going into your question, that would be great. While they're thinking about that, and we'll get some online as well, could I bring you back to this idea that you mentioned of being executive? And also just to link that to understanding or intelligence, to use a dreadful sort of military and agency word. How do you plan to create the intelligence that allows you to do the things that you spoke about there? Because most of the policy-focused departments of state don't traditionally have to burrow into those sort of things.
Yeah. I think the beauty of DBT is that we're both a policy department but also a delivery department. We have to be, because we are the face of business across Whitehall. So we're obviously putting in place policy, which we have done on sanctions, and OTS is going to enable us to enhance the work that we're doing. We all already work across Whitehall. I mean, this morning I've got officials here from the Treasury, HMRC, the Foreign Office, as well as DBT. And OTS will enable us to coordinate gathering more intelligence. But because we work with industry week in, week out, whether it's on supply chains, critical minerals or economic security, I'm hoping that we already have the confidence to be able to get more information from them, also commercially sensitive information from them as well. So work will continue, but work at a much more enhanced pace. I think the work that's been done by the Security Minister, once again, gathering intelligence there too. Look, I talked about my visit to Mongolia and Kazakhstan. I know the impact that sanctions have on industry. I know which products are quite hard to get hold of. I'm also then aware of which products are entering the market that we've already sanctioned. It's quite a small community depending on which sector that you're looking at. And the purpose of OTSI is to be able to not only coordinate across Whitehall, but to have enhanced powers to collect intelligence and go for those entities and individuals that are benefiting out of the sanctions by not playing ball, because there are many companies in the room here today that definitely play ball.
Thank you very much. Could I just build on that? You mentioned the Security Minister, and Tom Tugendhat, great friend of Policy Exchange as well. He has occasionally let it be known that he's looking at the city and other service providers, because some of even our friends will point out that London sometimes, Oliver Bullock's book, Butler to the World, has occasionally facilitated some of the practices that you're looking to stamp on. Is what you're setting up evidence of a renewed approach across government?
Well, the work's been taking place for the last couple of years within DBT and applying these sanctions when it came to industry. Obviously, we've got the Treasury present here that deal with the financial institutions. But I also co-chair a professional services network across the UK, and we need to make sure we're doing more on professional and business services, which is slightly more trickier to get hold of if people are trying to circumvent them. So working with industry most definitely matters. But as the conflict evolves, so our sanctions have to evolve as well. We need to try and appreciate how OTSI works to deliver for now and how OTSI will evolve to deliver post-conflict. What sort of sanctions do we have to have in place to ensure that Putin isn't able to upgrade his military capability, and how do we ensure that Russia doesn't continue down in Putinism, the term that you used in a paper on sanctions, I believe, post-conflict. So the fact that we have a department means that we can deal with the sanctions today and those that we need to investigate and fundamentally penalise, and how we deal with sanctions tomorrow as well. The department's been working flat out dealing with the circumstances in front of itself, and now we're able to take and reflect on how we try and deliver not only sanctions for the following year and the year after, but also how we spend even more resources in finding those culprits that aren't paying for.
Yeah, thank you very much. Could I just, the team here has reminded me on our big laser display screen, as fans of Radio 4 would know, could I just ask the online audience if they've got questions, so they could raise their virtual hand, and then the team here will come to you, and then I can patch you in here as well. And we have a question here. Can we have the microphone down here to this lady in the second row?
Hi. Hi.
You're on, yep.
That was very interesting, but one thing that...
Sorry, could I just ask you your name? And
my name is Catherine McBride. I'm an economist. I'm not really representing anyone but myself here. But I have written about sanctions in the last 6 months. And I was really surprised to hear you're setting up this department now when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And it does sound like you're expecting this conflict to continue. Would that be the right? And I was looking at some statistics on trade, and though the British have obviously been very helpful to Ukraine, it seems like a lot of European companies are quite happy to sell 5,000% more to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan than they've ever sold before. So we've got to assume that that's going into Russia by the back door. So, what's the point of British people setting this up now if the Europeans aren't playing ball? And also, if you're setting it up now, I'm guessing you're expecting this conflict to run and run. Sorry, is that a question?
So no, not at all. So the officials have been working on this for quite some time, which is why we've been able to prevent £20 billion worth of trade. But we've been having to respond to circumstances as they presented themselves, because the department had to just stand up and continue delivering these sanctions. What we want to do, what we will be doing with OTSI, is focusing our attention also to those individuals and entities that are circumventing the sanctions regime, and that requires, as you mentioned earlier, being able to gather intelligence and also having the legal powers to put in place quite harsh monetary penalties as well. So it's, the point of OTSI is that we've got the resources, we've got the scope, and we've got the ability to find you if you are trying to dodge the sanctions in place at the moment, and we will find you. We've now set up a standalone unit that's working with delivering the sanctions, but also identifying those people that are benefiting from the sanctions when they should not be as well. And the OTSI will evolve as the conflict evolves. We have to constantly look at how we degrade Putin's ability to fund the conflict, and also look at supply chains as well. Reflecting on supply chains, that isn't something we can just deliver by ourselves, because supply chains are fundamentally global. And we do work internationally with our partners when it comes to the sanctions regime. And the importance of OTSI, we've now got a standalone unit which is going to be seen as best in class in providing the intelligence that's needed to deal with firms. Not all of them are going to be UK focused. We might gather information on firms that aren't UK entities. We can share that with our partners if need be. But the reality is that we've got to continue to focus our attention on Ukraine and Putin, and OTSI will enable us to do that. Previously, we did not have the ability to focus on financial penalties that came through with different departments. We can do that as well now going forward. Obviously, like many people, would want this conflict to end, which is why I reflected on the fact that we have a standalone department. The sanctions will continue when the conflict comes to an end. It won't just stop the day the conflict stops. And the other job that I have is I am the minister in the UK government responsible for Ukraine reconstruction with the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Kubrikov, and we meet up regularly to talk about the physical reconstruction of Ukraine mid and post-conflict. And the number one issue they have is dealing with sanctions, and they raise those internationally, not just with us, and responding to that need as well. And I must read your book. I just caught up with your paper this morning, but I'll try and get hold of your book as well.
Thank you very much. And there's a question over here. So.
Hi, Sam Hogg from Asian to Britain. Thank you for that speech, Minister. I wondered if you could give some more detail about working with international partners, especially when, excuse me, we have international partners who might blacklist or sanction companies that we don't do the same here. Could you sort of elaborate a bit more on that, please? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam. I believe that Sam's probably asking a question that's mostly about China than Russia, if the company's called Beijing to Britain. We do work with our international partners. And the beauty of OTSI is that we can now be even more front-footed the way we engage with our international partners, whether they're American, European, or Japanese, or other Five Eyes allies that we have. A lot of it is about sharing information and intelligence. We'll be gathering much more of that than previously. If people have been circumventing sanctions now, once OTSI is now doing even further investigation and fundamentally next year applying penalties, some of those firms may then try and move themselves elsewhere to get away from our grip. We need to work with our international allies to get hold of them as well. As Sam, you will know, as you've worked with me on this in the past, I'm quite keen to gather as much information as I can from allies when they sanction entities and individuals, and we can do that more with OTSI too.
Could I just build on that? And could you say a little bit about the difficulties that arise when we look at dual-use technologies? Because one of the other things that's coming out of Ukraine, and the reason so many things are being shipped through Kyrgyzstan is, for example, chips in washing machines can be reflashed to be chips in drones.
Yeah.
And there are other technologies, the drones themselves, which you can pass off as perfectly ordinary civilian use. How are you framing that problem? How will you go about?
Well, the reality is that when you establish any policy, it's done at a period of time. And, a couple of years ago, not everybody was talking about semiconductors, for example. No. Or my other passion projects in the department, which is supply chains and critical minerals. These were seen as geek-type passions, but now they've become mainstream. So we need to be more aware of fuller supply chains and also be aware of dual-use technology that we didn't have the intelligence on how they could be applied previously. So OTSI will enable us to do the research in appreciating how technology can be used going forward. We can work with other government departments, with our international partners as well. I'll wear another hat. I'm also the Investment Security Unit Minister at the Cabinet Office, and obviously that is to look at and to screen investment into critical infrastructure into the UK. And when we legislated for the National Security Investment Act, it was at a period of time we hadn't really fleshed out the extra capabilities or the dynamics around genomics, for example, or dual-use technology. And OTSI, because it's a new department and it has the function in dealing with sanctions, will have the ability to be able to do that research as well. You're right, we only know what we know now, but we need to make sure the department has enough of a forecast to work out, if sanctions aren't being applied to particular goods, how those goods could be applied in next generation of technology.
And I'm really pleased you're pushing those geeky things.
Oh, thank you.
They are absolutely vital.
It's when geeks become mainstream a little bit, maybe.
Well, you could argue that some of our competitors got geeky earlier. And so my question, to turn that into a question, do you think OTSI could be a bit of a stimulus around government to take some of these geeky things, such as supply chains for minerals, for example, where we've seen China certainly have a long-standing policy, well before Made in China 25, to make sure it had an iron grip on some of these supply chains. Do you think are you going to be able to seed that thinking?
Edward, you're behind the curve. I was very blessed when I came into the department. We had a fantastic supply chain team. I can see my officials sitting in the room. We spent the last year working with industry to unpick critical imports that we need that are, could be dependent on hostile states or another COVID type situation. Paper we're launching on Wednesday. When I came into business and trade, I refreshed our critical mineral strategy, and the officials, gave up a lot of time and energy for us to do that. And within OTSI, without putting too much pressure on the team we have in place now, I don't think it's any longer geeky. I think we fully appreciate the fact that economic coercion can come from all sides, and we need to make sure that we are resilient in our supply chains here in the UK. I think geeks have become mainstream, Edward, I think now. There's a line we can take. Officials, can I say that now? We're all geeks, aren't we, in the room? We're all geeks in the room.
Everybody can walk into a meeting and shout quantum and AI now, can't they? Not sort of being a geek. And while we're on that subject of technology, I know that maybe about a year ago, the Pentagon started looking at AI for illuminating supply chains, because it can be very difficult when you get down to third and fourth tier suppliers to understand how all this works. So is there some thought going into how you could look at making use of technologies. A lot of the smaller countries haven't got the time and maybe the money to investigate this sort of thing, such that we can illuminate those supply chains and maybe inform companies of what they don't know, maybe can't know.
Possibly. I would say that the work that's been done on managing the environment means that firms are far more nimble in showcasing their supply chains to the very smallest supplier. And what we ask them to do within our critical input strategy is to make sure that their supply chains can be resilient and nimble going forward. Within the critical mineral works that I've been doing, it's working down quite closely to producer countries. So work is being done throughout the whole supply chain. But you're right, technology will evolve. We need to make sure that OTSI is gathering intelligence to understand how that technology is being used by Putin against Ukraine. But within OTSI, now that we have a standalone department, we can work with our international partners too in making sure that we're all on the same page.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have another hand up in the audience? If not, could I just come back to the question that was hinted at, and you picked up more than picked up on the hint, but maybe you could just explore it a little bit more. When you're dealing with those very large countries with whom we have a complicated relationship, such as China, how are you going to be able to target sanctions without fracturing relationships to address where we have genuine security concerns, but also allow us to still deal with these countries? And some of those, what you've just talked about, some of those technological areas, as we look at what will be demanded of us of the various COPs, there's dual-use technologies in there, are there not? So when you're dealing with China, the nuance of all of this, how's it going to be unpicked?
Well, one could argue I'm not familiar with the nuance because I did end up being sanctioned by China for exposing some of these challenges. But the reality is that we will continue to apply sanctions when we see fit. And the Foreign Office, I think, put out 43 sanctions in the last 2 weeks. And there was a response from the Chinese embassy in the UK that didn't feel as though the sanctions that applied to those Chinese firms should have taken place. But the point is we will not be afraid to apply sanctions as needed within the legislation that we have in place. But you're right, the relationships can be nuanced, but the reality is that we have to uphold what we are trying to establish in the UK with the legislation that we have in place, with the values that we uphold, and that we will do everything that we can to degrade Putin's ability to continue to fund this war in Ukraine. I suspect there may be much more newspaper headlines driven by the Chinese embassy if more of their firms are caught up in a sanctions regime. I would argue it's better they just do the right thing instead of being caught out.
And it's interesting, we've seen that play out across this administration with the way that the Prime Minister has put his language into exactly the same level as our AUKUS partners, for example. So the government seems absolutely in lockstep, if we can see that playing out. Any more questions from the room? There's one at the back there.
Marcus Solas Hendricks, Policy Exchange. On the topic of willingness of partners, which is obviously going to be crucial to OTSI and the wider sanctions regime of the UK, aside from China, when we're looking at partners, the FT ran an article, interesting, a few weeks ago on Turkey's trade account with Russia over the last almost 2 years. So what instruments will OTSI and HMG wider have when looking at countries such as Turkey or other partners with whom we have closer ties and actually are allies through NATO? Because obviously China, there's other issues aside. So in terms of the spectrum of partners and things who aren't going to necessarily be as willing, will we see more political pressure?
So there's big movement on countries like Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and Turkey as well. I mean, OTSI fundamentally will have the authorities deal with UK firms and UK entities, and that's where our focus will be. But we'll end up gathering information, no doubt, on entities that aren't British and maybe based in other countries that we will be sharing with our partners too. On international fora, they seem, well, in my experience, and I spend a lot of time with the Turkish ambassador on Ukraine reconstruction, believe it or not, there is a desire to try and get this right. There really is. And the more that we can do internationally collaboratively, the more pressure we can put at international forum, the more these countries will reflect on their own trading regimes they have with Russia. But we have to constantly be present and show why this work matters and how it's having an impact on Russia as well. There was recent feedback, recent data out about their economy. I know that manufacturing has been absolutely decimated in some sectors. I'm thinking about the car sector in particular, but they constantly need to find funds from elsewhere. If we can keep that engagement open and try and explain what we're doing will work for Turkey as much as it works for us, it means we can have that conversation a lot easier. OTSI will have much more intelligence than we have at the moment. We'll probably have it, no doubt, internationally relevant as well, which we can share too, and more countries that come online, it's easy to get other countries to come into step with us. But you're right, there are friendly countries that we would like to see engaged a lot less with Russia, but we need to give them a reason to be engaged a lot less.
Thank you very much. And we have a question online from a Rebecca Smith.
Hello, sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Can I check that you can hear me okay?
Yes, you're loud and clear in the room. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Firstly, I'd just like to thank the Minister for offering us this opportunity to be involved. My name is Rebecca Smith. I'm the Policy Manager at SMMT, so the Trade Association for Automotive Industry. I just want to say that, to automotive industries, fully behind the sanctions. We very much agree with the reasoning behind this, and now we're just focused on how we can comply with the sanctions. And I think you mentioned, you recognise that OTSI will need to have the support of businesses to make sure that, the guidance it provides works and has clarity for businesses. And so I was just wondering if you could say anything about how you envision that sort of collaboration with business going forward. Like, how can we get involved with you to help make sure, whether it be the guidance or anything that you're arranging with this office, ahead of perhaps New Year it's been set up, or even after that, really addresses the questions that we'll have. How can we be involved with that collaborative approach going forward, really? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. You know that I co-chair your group, so I spend every month with the auto sector. So we will, as the co-chair of the automotive sector, I'll be making sure that you're engaged with OTSI. But we know that OTSI can only work if we work with you, because we don't want you to be surprised by any decisions that we take, and we want to ensure that compliance is not just policy perfect but practical as well. So there'll be a series of events next year, and you can pick and choose the sort of events you want to come along to. Some will be consultation events, some might be longer, some might be shorter. There'll be events with officials, events with myself. I hope that over a period of time we can also share information that isn't too commercially sensitive, of course, but what's happening internationally and the sort of intelligence that we're gathering. We know that the last 2 years we have worked with most of industry to ensure that when we are applying sanctions, that we understand the impact of business and also appreciate what's happening with international partners as well. But next year we want to make sure that we are working with you as we are drafting, so you're not just hearing it towards the very end of it being established. And OTSI will have the capacity to do that as well.
Is it fair to say, because I know we have a lot of industrial people online here listening in, that they could start to view OTSI as their portal into government? As
so it should be the concierge service. And for most of industry, they will have access to me anyhow. I co-chair the Aerospace Council, the Automotive Council, the Construction Council, the Professional Business Services. So the beauty of me holding this brief, it means that I always have the back of my mind, how does it impact UK business? They have to consciously make a decision to come and invest in the UK and continue to do business in the UK. I want to make sure that we're providing the best business environment, and obviously applying sanctions as needed, but not being too heavy-handed if there are comparators elsewhere. We want to make sure we're consulting with them the whole time.
Great, thank you very much. I don't think there's any more questions online. Are there any more questions in the room? Because we could be dangerously close to finishing this session on time. And therefore, could I just offer you the chance, just if you wanted everyone in the room and online to go away with one overall thought from today, other than make sure they download your paper on supply chains on Wednesday?
Oh my gosh, well, supply chain, that is on Wednesday. Look, we're not just a policy department, we're a delivery department. And not only are we going to be making sure that OTSI is ensuring that those individuals that are bending the rules or flaunting the rules or hiding the rules can get the message today that we will find you. We will have the intelligence, and we will also have the authority to provide with financial penalties as well. There's no way of escaping what we're trying to do when it comes to our sanctions portfolio, and we will do everything that we can to degrade Putin's ability to have the resources, as you mentioned, the economy matters, the resources to continue his illegal invasion of Ukraine. OTSI is a standalone department. It has the resources to gather intelligence. We now have the time and space, because we've spent the last 2 years dealing with the sanctions on Russia, to make sure that we're working at a pace with our partners, and our partners are industry representatives in the room and online, to make sure that we are applying sanctions that are fit for purpose. But the message is that if you are trying to circumvent these sanctions via OTC, we're going to find you.
Great, thank you very much. You've covered so much ground this morning in really quite a relatively short space of time. When you think we've looked at supply chains, we've looked at making sure we've got access to minerals for both the Industrial Revolution and the Green Revolution that's getting conflated. We've looked at working with allies to make sure that we can counter the autocracies, and you've even talked about that war raging in continental Europe at the moment, and what you're doing, actually taking 400 billion out of the war chest of Putin already. And as I say, as a military guy, that will do a heck of a lot more than some of the onesies and twosies, the bits of military kit that we can give. So it's vitally important work. So thank you very much for taking the time this morning to brief us all on it. Could I just ask the audience to thank in the usual way?